Showing the training page.
Showing the training page. Great.
Yes.
Okay, so you should be able to, if you go to your course dashboard, I'll just go back there. So if you go to your dashboard, then you click on the course. If you click in module 1, the Y, it's just popping up here for me. Again, and local walking activity and case study. So when you click on that, you'll get the quite simple instructions about going for a walk, identify a typical walk in your neighborhood. It doesn't need to be very long, 500 meters is plenty. Walk through the route and consider the key conflict points related to safety, security or accessibility and convenience on your walk. And then the second part of the homework is to complete a survey. So you'll find the link here in part 2, and that's where you can put some information about your walk. And we're going to ask you to identify the conflict points and then think about how they could potentially be treated, what kind of crossings and things. So it shouldn't take very long. You can do that. There was also the survey gives you a bit of an understanding of what it's like to participate in a survey as a community member. And so there's another opportunity there to go through a bit of a case study as well and provide input on that. So in the next session, which I'll be running, we'll be talking through some of the results of these surveys and seeing what data we came up with and having a look at that data set. So if you make sure that you get that done over the weekend, by Monday, then I can process the results and have them ready to go next week. There we go. Now my next task is to introduce Bridget. Is that right?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Well, I have been working on this and I'm pretty pleased with my introduction this time. So I'm going to introduce Bridget in terms of the top 5 things I think you need to know about Bridget. So the first one is that her PhD in cognitive psychology about mind wandering, hang on, I'm still sharing my screen, about mind wandering during everyday driving is fascinating and will form part of today's sessions. And it's one of those very interesting topics that actually appeals to a broad audience as well, which I think is quite good for a traffic kind of research area. The second thing you need to know is she's a Venn diagram master. If you hand her what we call a wicked problem, don't be surprised if she hands it back in 3 neat little circles with work instructions in the middle. Fair, Bridget?
Yeah, continue.
Yeah. Just reading her LinkedIn feed will make you a better person. She has a Master of Engineering and Transportation, a Doctor of Philosophy, is a chartered member of Engineering New Zealand, Principal Researcher of MR Cagney, Chair of Transportation Group New Zealand, and she has a bicycle trailer for her cello.
Well, true things.
True. Welcome. We are very excited to have Bridget here today. I think we have some, there's some new content, so that will be new to all of us. And I will hand over to Bridget now.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Prue. Ko Ngāti Pākehā toku iwi noa kirikiri rā aho ko Doran toku whānau. Here we are, and today we're going to talk about people and transport, which are my 2 favourite topics. So we'll rip into it. And just like Wednesday, we're going to have some breaks mixed in. We're going to have some interactive Miro sessions. Kathy or Prue will put the Miro link up in the chat when we need it. And if you have any questions or comments in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll either address those as we go, or we've got some breaks where we can talk about those as well. So if anything comes to mind, feel free to pop it in there. As Prue said, I spend too much time on social media. my poison of choice is LinkedIn. And I like that because this is really where we find our professional community. And I think if we're going to survive the next couple of decades as a species, we need to double down on community. And for me, that means the people who I live around in my neighbourhood, and also the people who I feel that I can learn from and work with internationally, wherever they might be. So lucky us in the 21st century, we can find those people and make them laugh and do good at the same time. So that's always helpful. Today, we're going to talk about these 4 things, why inclusion is important, all in the context of raised crossings, wombat crossings, of course, transport psychology, mostly about drivers and how they actually think when they're driving a car and what they're thinking about and what that has to do with how they interact with pedestrians, people crossing the street. The principles of inclusive transport, SOS, and that's where this brand new content comes in that Prue hasn't even seen yet, and it's related to my mug which is not where I make my Venn diagrams, have a special app for that. And lastly, we're going to talk about disability sector engagement, which comes back to the start of why inclusion is important and what we can do about it. But the first slide that I've got here was brought to mind recently. I was in Australia actually and speaking at the Victoria Walks conference in Melbourne, and I was talking to a disability advocate who'd spoken at that conference as well, and she didn't like my use of the term disabled people, and that's because of a cultural difference. There are lots of different ways around the world that people refer to people, and one of the things we talk about is disability. In Australia, person first language is preferred, I think, and I think it varies in different parts of Australia and different communities, but people with disabilities is a lot more common. In New Zealand, disabled people is a lot more common, and these terms come from those communities themselves. And in both countries, the governments have engaged with people with disabilities, disabled people, and ask them, how would you like to be referred to? So when I say disabled people, just bear in mind that that might not be the best term to use where you're working. So the best way to find out is to talk to people and ask them. That's why I use that language. So why is inclusion an important part of this topic and why we're all here today? I'm going to take you through 3 different stories about why that is. And the first one is about Martha. Sometimes when I introduce these stories, I ask people to close their eyes. You might like to do that. I can't see whether you're doing that or not, unlike when I'm doing this at an in-person event. It might be quite a novel experience for you to close your eyes. Just stay with me though. So Martha is a businesswoman, and she is on her way to work in the commuter peak hour on the train. She's waiting at the train platform for her train, and then she notices that the people all around her pause, stand up, and leave the platform. And she doesn't think too much about that until she sees that the train she was supposed to catch is leaving from a different platform. And there had been an audible announcement saying so, but Martha is deaf and she didn't hear that announcement, and there was no other way that the transport system had to let her know that the platform had changed. So that meant that she was rushing and late for work, and added stress and a time cost to her day. You keep your eyes closed if you're so inclined. The next story is about Lara and Kelly. Lara and Kelly both use wheelchairs, and they're friends who live in Auckland, and they were going to go to a concert. So they found out in advance that the concert venue had an accessible bathroom. So they were happy about that they could at least find out that information. So they were going to get the bus to this concert. The first bus that went past to pick them up didn't stop because it was full. The second bus that went past, the driver refused to put the ramp down, which happens sometimes, even though it's illegal against human rights legislation. And the third driver came past, and there was room on the bus, but only for one person using a wheelchair, not for 2. So Lara and Kelly didn't want to be separated, so they decided they would traverse the streets together, even though it was an effort for them to do that. And they got to the concert venue and found that even though it has an accessible toilet, there were steps to get into the building. So the building itself wasn't accessible in the first place, and they couldn't get in. So they turned around and went home again, didn't get to attend. And the third story is about Duncan, and Duncan is a blind person who I know actually, who lives in Auckland also, and he was using the streets near where he lived. There had been some new construction of crossings and an upgrade of an intersection gone in the town centre near where he lives in the suburbs, and the tactile paving had been laid incorrectly. So when Duncan lined himself up with the tactile paving, where he thought he was headed across the street, he was actually headed right into the middle of a 4-way intersection. And it was only on alerting the council to the fact that they were laid incorrectly that something was done about it, and the fact that he had someone with him who could tell him, actually, no, don't walk that way, you'll be right in the middle of the intersection. And this is an everyday risk and hazard and challenge for people who are blind, particularly when they're going somewhere new, because you can imagine if you can't see, then you're reluctant to trust infrastructure in places that aren't familiar to you, because this kind of thing happens quite a lot. So you can open your eyes now, those of you who left us. And the whole purpose of this inclusion part of the talk really is to emphasize that not everybody has the same lived experience of getting around streets. And so if we don't have that, then we need to seek it out. And either that's built into our design standards that we account for all kinds of people, or we talk to people who might be affected through engagement and work out what we might need to change about stuff. Because if we don't, then there's a time cost for people to get around, people who have the fewest choices. So we've done a lot of surveys of disabled people in transport, and they'll tell us things like this example. It was my mother's birthday, it was in the central city, would have been an absolute nightmare with unreliable trains, next to no close parking, so somebody who can't walk very far, for example, and having to pay for both parking and petrol on a low income seemed like a nightmare. So the outcome is that people don't make trips that they would otherwise make. As I alluded to in the story about Duncan, tactile ground surface indicators can make or break a journey or a person. And actually, when I've talked with local advocates for the blind, they will say that a lot of blind people don't know what a tactile paving is. You can imagine that if you well, it's actually quite hard to imagine, to look at the world without knowing what something is that you've known your whole life. I remember when I was at civil engineering school and I did some roadworks in the summer as a practical job, and before that I never noticed an edge marker post on a rural highway. So we have these plastic white sticks on rural highways in New Zealand. They've got a little red hazard marker on them. I literally never even noticed them before, and then now every time I'm driving down highways I see them because I've learned that and it's part of my lingo. But most people don't know what these yellow things on the footpaths are. And a lot of blind people don't either. So it's really important that if we go to the effort of installing them, that they're correct, because then when people do learn about them, they might not trust them. Inclusion. Yep.
Sorry, we've just had a question here. People with accessible needs, just in talking about the language you use, could we just go back to that for a second? And we just had a question there about people with accessible needs. Is that a more appropriate way to speak about people?
It's a way. I prefer disabled people because that's the people that I work with say that that's their preference. People with access needs is another term that is used. They're not bad. It's just a bit less direct than saying disabled people. And I think one of the reasons that the disabled people I work with prefer that is because it's very direct and obvious, whereas if you start, the more other terms you start introducing, the more kind of convoluted you make the language, the less simple it is, and then you can lose some of the impact actually. Yeah. So people like to own the fact that they are disabled by a transport system that doesn't work for them, for example.
And if you can, checking with the people who you're
100%. Yes, and that might even change depending on the context that you're working in. So if you're at a community meeting and there are people there who are invited because they're from disability sector or from some kind of group, just ask them. I'd ask them as well, like right in that meeting, I'm going to talk about this stuff. How would you like to be referred to, if at all? Yeah, for sure. So our policy requires us in theory to provide transport that meets the needs of all people, and every policy in government around the world will say these nice things about how we're committed to understanding, for example, the expectations and needs of our customers, our people. We're required to comply with disability legislation, and every country that we work in has some kinds of human rights legislation that require us to consider these things. And that's quite helpful when you need to argue for a raised crossing, for example, and you might end up someone saying, well, it costs more, why should we do that? And say, well, actually, it's our obligation to make sure that we're providing for all people, and this is the best way to do that. Sometimes it can help. In New Zealand, we have government policy statement on land transport. It's changing, it changes all the time, but generally, they all say these kinds of words, especially this first sentence. We need to enable a range of transport choices so all people can easily access all of these things. Well, that's the dream, right? All people easily access would be good, while reducing adverse effects on the climate and public health. So in some ways, I like the term of people with access needs because it means that we're not putting people in boxes. And when I talk about who needs inclusive transport, really it's everybody. And this diagram is just an example of all of the different strengths and weaknesses we all have with our body, right? Like some people can see well, some can't see at all. Some of us get to age 42 and your optometrist says it's all downhill from here. We have varying abilities to hear in different contexts as well, different amounts of strength. And so on a day-to-day basis, we might be at the top of our game or not, and some of these strengths and weaknesses might come into play when we're trying to navigate transport system, especially when we talk about human states, because we're not always at the peak of our powers, right? Like before you've had a coffee or after you've had a few drinks at the end of the day, you might not have as much or the same amount of energy and alertness that you would when you're at your peak. Even different times of the day, you know, straight after lunch, like we are now in New Zealand, people are naturally lower energy and we go through cycles, right? Sometimes you're feeling sick or you're just feeling anxious for some reason. A lot of people have become familiar with this more often through COVID, right? Like long COVID affects fatigue. We've all have colleagues that have experienced that. And just the whole pandemic situation and planetary crises and eco-anxiety means that sometimes we're not feeling as confident and happy and energetic as we are on other days. And that can affect the way we use transport systems. We can be less alert. We can be less likely to be proactively looking for traffic when we're crossing the street, for example. So considering all of these things is useful from a human context, let alone talking about any kind of long-term disability or impairment. So considering those characteristics and states, we're going to jump over to the Miro board and think about some that come to mind for you in terms of feeling sick, feeling tired, feeling well, feeling not. Maybe an example you know from your life, like when I've got 3 kids in the back seat crying or fighting or singing or distracting me. What's a situation that leads to a characteristic or state that affects using crossings? So you go into the chat, you'll see the Miro board. I think you're probably all in there already. And we'll see.
Floating around. I can see a lot of people floating here.
Great. So mine's just loading up as well. We need to find, mine's taken a while to load. I don't know about you, Prue.
Let me just share.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay. Go.
Oh, sweet. There we are.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So what kinds of characteristics or states in terms of, you know, if someone is an Olympic athlete or out for a jog versus somebody who's walking home with their shopping or pushing a child in a pram, what else could you think of that might affect whether someone could use this crossing easily? Sleepless nights is a good one. Energy actually doesn't often all comes back to energy, and a lot of things affect that. If someone gave you a decaf instead of a full caffeinated coffee, it's not going to go well for you. And even just, you know, feeling grumpy, you might be more likely, I don't know, I haven't seen any research on it, but I bet pedestrians are more likely to charge on through a crossing if they're grumpy or angry, or drivers as well, less likely to look around them. Because, and we'll come back to this later, when you're self-absorbed for whatever reason, whether you're really excited or depressed or grumpy, then you're inward looking, right? Like you're thinking about your own thoughts and not necessarily scanning the world around you, looking for inspiration. This is great. I thought that said accountant for a second, but it says ambulance. See, I told you my eyes are past their best.
It seems to me too that one of the things about walking or going for a walk is that it shouldn't be a prerequisite that you have to be on high alert.
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Often we're doing it to escape high alert states.
There's a lot of literature actually around the value of the wander. You know, even people like Einstein, I think, would say if they're having trouble with what they're working on, they'd go for a walk. Like it's known as clearing your head. What does clearing your head mean? It means that you can just relax and let your guard down and not be focused on any one thing in particular, right? And when people are in stressful urban environments, even the fact that stressful urban environment is a phrase we understand tells us a lot about what busy urban places, what demanding environments do to pedestrians. You can imagine that somebody out walking on the moors in England is probably more relaxed, if the weather's good, than somebody trying to get somewhere in a hurry in the middle of Tokyo or Manhattan.
I try to tell the children that the cars are like the tigers. We just can't take our eyes off them. We need to be aware of them, even when we're not on the road, but we're walking next to it and there's a tight corner and stuff. So
that's very good. I must have told my son when he was little that you never trust an indicator, and he always says, or an alligator. So maybe if we switch that up, never trust an alligator or an indicator.
I like it.
Not that we even have alligators in this country. Okay. Cool. I think we will come back because we've got another exercise very shortly. Awesome. Back to sharing this. Right. So yes, I think you get that everybody is different levels of competence and alertness at different times in their life. And this goes back to what Hafez was saying yesterday about the safe system, actually, that humans are vulnerable, they make mistakes, they're not perfect AI robots. Even perfect AI robots aren't perfect, right? Because they have been designed by humans, they're fallible, they can never have every situation manufactured for them before they're trained. So we need to account for these characteristics when we're designing anything in transport. And an important consideration on top of those things is income. And it's increasingly important. I don't know as much about Australia, but in New Zealand, we've got what the media keeps calling the cost of living crisis. And what that means is that housing's getting less affordable, the cost of food is going up, so people have less and less discretionary income to spend on things like travel. And it can be very hard for people who have never had huge money pressures. I don't know all of your situations, maybe you have, but a lot of people who work in transport are paid well enough that these day-to-day pressures on living aren't as prevalent as they are for some other people who we're designing for, some people in our communities who really can't afford an alternative from walking down the road to get somewhere, even if it's to the bus. So income is a really important consideration, and that comes in when we commission or complete analyses of equity, and that's becoming more common in transport projects to do an equity analysis of a project to see who's going to be affected and what we can do about it to make sure that we're not worsening equity with our investment. So, we are going to go back into Miro straight away. So you don't think you need to share, Prue, because I can see people back in here already swarming like ants. It's so cool. What has income got to do with raised crossings? And now, if you look on this slide on your screen, you'll see on the menu on the left, underneath the arrow, if you go all the way down to the plus sign, it says more apps. There's stickers and emojis, and you can choose a sticker that represents your response to these statements. How do these statements make you feel? I've got one that I used yesterday. So there we go. I've put the sticker over in fancier cars. So over to the left in the menu underneath the arrow, all the way down to the plus sign, it says more apps. There's stickers and emojis. You can choose one from what you see there, or you can search for one that might express how you're feeling. How do we feel about these statements? Cool, people are starting to do that. So the first one is poorer areas get less infrastructure investment. How do you feel about that? The second one is poorer people are less likely to have a car, so they're forced to walk. And the third statement is people in fancier cars are less likely to give way to pedestrians. And I have seen a study which looked into that exact thing. So they looked at the brand, make and model of cars and whether or not they stopped for a pedestrian at, I think it was a zebra crossing in the States, I think. I'll see if I can find it and send it to the article to Kathy for your collection. And they found that it was true that people in Mercedes and BMWs in this case were less likely than people in all other cars to stop for pedestrians. Conclude from that what you will. I don't know.
You've kind of ruined my day with these ones, Bridget. I've seen them before, but I'd forgotten.
Yeah, sorry. We'll end on a high note.
Okay.
There's a graph somewhere in your future. Maybe next time I'll make a Venn diagram. So the poorer areas get less infrastructure investment. It's a bit hard to prove that, because how do you define infrastructure investment and poorer area? It's often the case that newer areas are wealthier. So they look shinier and have better infrastructure, but we have a lot of gentrification as well, right? So there is some research that says, yeah, this is actually true. People have concluded that wealthier places get more investment, and partly it's because people who are wealthier have more time and energy and more understanding of how government investment works to complain and advocate for that infrastructure than people who live in a very poor area, and their immediate needs, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, if you know what that is, like their immediate needs for shelter and food and security are far more important than advocating to the council for a pedestrian crossing, for example, even if they knew how to do that. Yeah, cool. Well done. Okay, we will come back to here. So there is a really cool resource that I've got a link to here. It's in the slides. It's called the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, I think it's called. And it frames impairment, the word it uses, impairment, in terms of permanent, temporary, and situational. So a permanent impairment is what we might traditionally think of as a disability, because it's permanent. And the examples in this picture here relate to all the different senses that people have. So there's another mode of permanent disability, which is mobility, right? So somebody might have a permanent mobility impairment and they are stuck with that. That might have been from when they were born. They might have acquired it in their life, but when they acquire it, then it becomes permanent. But there are also temporary impairments. Anybody who's had a broken limb, or well, have a look at some of the examples on there. If you have a headache, I really like that migraine example, actually, because I haven't had many migraines in my life, thank goodness, but I have had a couple. And when they use the word debilitating, that's an impairment, right? You literally can't think of anything else because it's so painful and consuming, which obviously affects your ability to do things like walk safely and drive. And then there's a situational impairment, which I think is a really interesting way to consider how humans are. And it comes back to designing for humans in all of the ways that they are, rather than trying to make humans behave like robots. We know that people will be distracted sometimes. If they're not illegally distracted in the car, there are legal and illegal distractions, aren't there? You're not allowed to use your mobile phone while driving in New Zealand, but you are allowed to eat a hamburger. You're allowed to talk to passengers. You're allowed to have children with you in the back seat. And then it becomes up to a police officer to decide whether you're not in full control of the vehicle. But this is a grey area, right? This is just humans being humans, trying to live their lives. So it can be helpful to think about it in that way, because again, it expands our thinking beyond some kind of group of people or a certain box that we might put people in. Actually, situational impairments in particular affect all of us all the time. So have a comment in the chat.
Just a quick observation. I was reading a book the other day, and it's called Baby Brain, and it's all research about how children's behavior affects our brains and how our brains are designed to adapt to it. And it was just saying that there's clear kind of connections in the brain that are developed in terms of responding to a baby's cry or something like that.
Absolutely.
And no, it's just something, when you're driving and suddenly if there's a baby crying, it's completely torn in terms of
yes.
Need to stop.
Yeah, 100%. Sometimes even it's not your baby, right? It's just I bet there's we could talk about that all day, like especially if you're a mother yourself, and then suddenly the game changes. You just feel so much more compelled to respond to this thing. Cool. So in the webinar chat, comment in here about a situational impairment that affects people crossing the street. So my example is carrying coffees for everyone in the office. You know how sometimes you come up to a crosswalk with a button, like a big button they call them, to please may I cross the street safely, thank you. And if you're holding a lot of stuff, then you're like, oh, you're trying to bump it with your knee or your elbow, and then really your priority is the coffee and not your own safety in that moment, right? So there are these kinds of things. Arguing is an interesting one. We'll talk about that a bit later when we get to the mind wandering driving But there's like a continuum of things that are clearly very unsafe, like driving drunk or talking on a mobile phone. And then there's things that probably are unsafe. Like, what about, has anybody ever driven when they're really emotional? Like, crying is not a good place to be in when you're driving, right? You know yourself that I probably shouldn't be driving, but usually you've got a pretty compelling reason to go somewhere when you're in that situation. So
okay, we've got thinking about work, talking to a companion. I think I seem to have the most complicated crossing scenario. Children and bikes and swimming bags and a dog. I'm sure.
Yep.
A minor injury, rushing because you're late. Seeing someone you know across the street.
And sometimes these things can kind of interrupt the rule that's running your brain, right? You kind of feel yourself snapped out of it. If you see someone you know, especially if it's someone that you really like or really don't like, it kind of changes your goal in the moment, doesn't it? From either wanting to be there or really not, really not.
It was interesting. I was looking through crash records and looking through really detailed accounts of them, of different road users that had been involved in crashes. And I kind of recoded them into the different age groups. And for teenagers, every time one of these crashes occurred, there was always some kind of distraction. Their mum was on the other side of the road, or they were following a friend or talking. And it was quite an apparent trend.
So we'll come back to that later when Prue, when I show my graph about attentional regulation and which kind of driver people are. Teenagers, when they're driving, they haven't quite learned to regulate, obviously from your evidence, right? They haven't learned to regulate their attention as effectively as other people might.
Yeah.
This is really great examples, and see if you can talk to your colleagues and even your friends about this term situational impairments, because I think it just fosters a lot of empathy for people because they're so human, these examples that you're coming up with. Yeah, overexcited people. I have seen a lot of research on ADHD and driving actually, and conversely, we were talking with Hafez last time about mindfulness and even meditation and the ability of calmness practices to make people better drivers, and there's a lot of good support for those kinds of things. Okay, so I just added a slide in here just to remind you that we'll have I've got a slide that says questions in a couple of slides. So if you've got any questions or comments about this kind of stuff, put them in the chat now and we'll get to them in a couple of minutes. If you're wondering about any of this or got any thoughts about how it might relate to your work, put it in the chat. So one of my favorite things to do when we're talking about inclusion as an objective in transport is to compare it to what else we do in transport. And in road safety, you'll all be familiar with, even more so after Hafez's session, about the outcome measure. So we have an objective and an outcome measure. The objective for road safety is to reduce fatal and serious crashes, reduce trauma. Sometimes there's other things as well, like promoting active travel, for example, but ultimately there's a really clear outcome that we measure for road safety. And even as Prue said, we have crashes, we can measure them and record them and see how they're tracking at a micro level and at a country and a global level. When we increasingly talk about climate change as an investment objective in transport, we know that usually outcome measure is something like measuring a reduction in emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And in transport, that is now sometimes referred to, or the proxy measure for that is vehicle kilometres travelled. So particularly if we don't have electric vehicles, then a reduction in kilometres travelled will be a good outcome from a climate change perspective, right? When we have an objective of efficiency and reducing congestion, then we might have an outcome measure around kilometres travelled as well. So in the same amount of network space, if we have fewer kilometres travelled, that will be more efficient. We can have speed measures. So how long does it take to get from A to B? And Google Maps is a really good way to talk about that with your friends and family as well, because it's all doing that for us all the time. When we sit in our driveway and a certain time of the day, we think, I'm not sure what's going to be the quickest. You look at Google and it tells you, usually pretty accurate which route you should take to get there the quickest. And that's a network efficiency metric. For inclusion, even though, like I said, our policy suggests that we should be including all people, and naturally we all agree with that, we should be, we don't have a known or common outcome measure? What's the thing that we're trying to achieve? And I think that might be why it's not so commonly done in transport, because there's no target. It's just kind of an ad hoc, if you feel like it, intervention. So what I recommend, I've been saying for a long time, is that I think we should be measuring equity of participation, because the problem, if we're not inclusive, is that people don't use the transport that we're designing. It's not that they use it and aren't safe, because that's a road safety outcome, but that they are put off using it, or they don't like it, or that makes them anxious, or they physically can't navigate it. Then they don't use it, and that can mean, like some of the stories earlier, that it becomes a trip that they don't make, and then that means they're not participating. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later in terms of how I think we can actually measure that, but we'll see if we've got any questions in the chat.
Well, we do. Hi, Bridget. I'd be particularly interested in support for people with ADHD and driving issues.
Yeah, so like I said, the only research, well, I'll put some, I'll give some to Kathy, a couple of articles to put in the in your dashboard online. But the only thing that I saw talked about the value of mindfulness, meditation, and practice for all people, actually. I can't remember if that was focused specifically on ADHD, because the research I found just when I was studying psychology and driving, there was research that says that people with ADHD are more prone to a certain kind of crash, distracted driving crash, usually. But I can't remember if there was anything specifically to do about that beyond this generic mindfulness is good for everybody. Yeah, but really the answer as transport professionals is to make environments where people are safe, regardless of how they're made, right? So accounting for all people, and race crossings is just such a good example of that, because they slow everyone down, they're very obvious, very conspicuous.
Attention. There's a question here. Customer complaints could be a measure in terms of...
Yeah, customer complaints is probably a proxy measure right now. So actually, one thing that I find really interesting is that with the rise of electric scooters in our urban places, we're becoming a lot more used to complaints about curb cuts because people fly off their scooter at a dodgy curb cut, and then that gets brought to the attention of the council, and then people who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices will say, well, yeah, there's problems with curb cuts all over the city, but the emphasis might not necessarily be on the right place. So complaints are really useful, but imagine if we relied on complaints to do road safety investment. We'd probably not be targeting the most useful places, right? So I think they're super useful in the absence of other stuff, but only really as a layer in all of our evidence about where we should be investing and why. Because as we said earlier, complaints tend to come from people with the time and energy and insight to know how to complain in the first place. The complaints process needs to be accessible, which it isn't always. And there needs to be mechanisms to respond to them in a pragmatic and kind of just way. Cool. So now we're going to move into the fun part, which is human behaviour in traffic. And this is, we've talked a bit about it, people being distracted, people not regulating their attention. And my interest in this area comes from my PhD research. As Prue said, I studied cognitive psychology, and I was interested, really, I've always been interested in how people think, how we know that, how we can get insights into how people who are different from me think, because that's the great human conundrum, right? We are sitting inside our own head for our whole lives, and we're only always really guessing what the perspective is like from another person's head. And psychology is the most direct science we have to investigate that. So that's what I did. Wait a second, what's driver behaviour got to do with the who of race crossings? This module isn't all about disability and inclusive access and the crossing itself. It's about driver behaviour as well. And why is that important? Well, all of these reasons. Hafez talked about the safe system, the fact that humans make mistakes, and that speech management is super important. All of these things come back to driver behaviour. Prue next week is going to talk about really transport psychology in practice, which is how do we know where to put these things? Well, it comes down to road environments and a hierarchy that makes sense, that is intuitive to people. What does intuitive mean? Well, it connects to their brains in ways that they understand. And when we talk about forgivingness as a criteria for a place to put a crossing, that means that even if people aren't thinking about what they're doing, they're not likely to be involved in a fatal or serious crash. And then perhaps even the most obvious link is to design criteria. Why do we even have safe sight distances and reaction times and visibility metrics? Well, they come from the way that humans are and the way that they can realistically react and respond to things. And all of that stuff comes back to driver behavior and psychology. So we're going to talk a bit more about that. And when I was deciding on my PhD topic, transport psychology is quite a big area. You can learn about lots of stuff, but I was interested in this link between thinking and safety. So if you think about this graph, you can be thinking about driving and you can be safe, and that's the place where driving instructors would tell us to be all the time. But psychologists say, hang on a minute, you can be not thinking about driving and still be safe. That's interesting, isn't it? And that's the area that I was most interested in, because I know myself, I'm not always thinking about driving when I'm driving. I haven't been in a crash of my own causing ever. So there must be something that we do that keeps us safe, even if we're not thinking about it. So that's what I wanted to explore. And while I was coming up with this topic, this billboard was on a state highway near my house, and I went past it and almost crashed thinking about it. I didn't. But I was like, if wandering minds cause crashes, how come I haven't crashed? Because my mind's wandering right now. And how do you even know that? Because for anything to cause a crash, you have to know how prevalent it is when crashes happen and how prevalent it is when they don't. So when we have crash prediction models, for example, we know that if we put in a raised crossing, like Hafez said yesterday, there's a roughly 70% reduction in crashes. We know that because we compare crossing sites with them to crossing sites without them. So who's done the study of wandering minds and non-wandering minds? And how do you know how often this thing happens in the first place to put up this billboard? Just the facts, people. So that's where I came in. Nobody had done that work to know how often drivers' minds are wandering in the first place, and that's what I wanted to do. So there's this intersection of safe and unsafe behavior, thinking about driving and thinking about other things. And I wanted to know where mind wandering sat in that. What was it that made it okay? And in what situations is it not safe? And how does this quadrant work in particular? So this is mind wandering during everyday driving. Everyday driving doesn't cause crashes most of the time. So if people are daydreaming as much as I am, how does that even work? Now, this topic is been assumed for a long time to be something that shouldn't exist. We are told that we should concentrate on driving. It's probably the most common phrase that parents of teenage drivers will utter when they're sitting next to them in the passenger seat. Concentrate, pay attention. And for a long time, motorists have been annoyed by other people who are not concentrating. So we have all of these quotes here. My favorite is on the bottom left of your screen. Driving is a full-time job. When the tongue wags, the mind lags. It cannot safely be combined with sociability, lovemaking, sightseeing, window shopping, or daydreaming. So in that sentence, we've got daydreaming lumped together with lovemaking as hazardous things to do while driving. And I don't think they're really the same, especially in terms of their impact. So that's what I wanted to
That could be your next research, Bridget.
Oh, it's been done. I will give you a link. Honestly, I was amazed it was published. Here we go. So one of the first papers that I reviewed when mind wandering was kind of coined as a term in transport psychology, one of the first sentences in the abstract was driver mind wandering is associated with risk for crash involvement. And again, I was like, how do you know that if you don't know how often drivers' minds are wandering in the first place? So let's get your views here before we dive into my data and what I found. What do you think about when you are driving? And if you're not a driving person, what do you think that other drivers think about? I think about, yeah, put it in the chat, let you know that I think about whether or not I'm thinking about what drivers are thinking about and I go around in circles. Oh, that's interesting. Someone's scared. Fishing. Dinner is a very common one. Food. Did I tell you, Prue, I wanted to call one of my papers what women are thinking about on the daily commute, food, friends, and F-foot drivers, because that's kind of where they go.
That is catchy.
Yeah, it was vetoed by my supervisors.
Oh.
That where I'm going, what I'm going to do there is yep, really common. That'll come up. A lot of people think about other people and just kind of go off on this train of thought about who that person is to be driving that way.
Oh. I really love this question. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
We could just sit here for hours, really.
Yeah, we could. The quickly reaching the destination one, I don't think I go into that, but there is, I think, a subset of drivers, and particularly in New Zealand and Australia, going on the questionnaire data that I've seen, very competitive. And there's a subset of drivers that want to get there quickly, even if they're just going home and they have no deadline. They want to feel like they've won. So sometimes they'll be, if I ask them what they're thinking about and they've just been through an intersection, they'll say, oh, I should have been in the other lane. I would have been 5 meters ahead by now. Like, just...
quite a competitive mindset or something.
Yes, they want to win, even though it's not actually a competition. In their head, it is, and they want to have chosen the quickest route, right down to which lane they are in at an intersection to get through quicker. How much quicker are we?
Like, it's very different if you're running late somewhere.
Yes,
the situation. Yeah, so it's one of the temporary impairments.
I think people have different modes, like how relaxed you are, right? Like usually if you're relaxed and chill, you have a certain way of thinking. If you're under pressure for some reason, trying to get somewhere, especially if you're accountable to someone at the other end, like sometimes you're picking up a child from school and they're sick, or meeting someone and it's raining, or whatever, there's kind of different levels of urgency out there to trying to get there. And like for some reason we think that focusing on driving will get us there quicker, even though it probably doesn't make much difference.
I like this one. Ooh, is that a new shop?
Like, oh, yep, that's super common. I'll talk about that a bit later because there's some psychological reasons for that. Cool.
How much my trip would have been if I rode my bike? Like,
yeah, I often think that too. Or how much less alive would I be if I rode my bike? Well, that's a whole other story. Okay. Oh, it's time for my video. So this is examples of actually what people are thinking about when they're driving. This is how I did my some of my research. I sat next to people when they were driving their cars on their daily commutes. Actually, this one was a trip around Hamilton City on roads these people are familiar with. And every so often, I would say, what are you thinking about now? And they didn't know when I was going to ask that question. I just sat there quietly for the rest of the time. And this is some of what they said. A lot of people have more than one thought going on at once, obviously. It's true, he was. There is sound in this video, but it's very quiet, so don't worry if you can't hear it. That's why there's the captions on it. Cool. So you can see that if you're trying to categorize these thought samples as driving related or not, some of them are quite clear, right? Sometimes people are saying, I'm looking at the guy behind me, how close he is. That's certainly driving related. Other things like, he's probably frustrated at a lady going along at 50. That's kind of driving related, but it's also related to personal kind of self-reflection, right? Like some kind of maybe embarrassment or pride in being a little old lady or whatever. It's gone a bit further from directly driving related to more an internal kind of reflection. And so I like those examples because they just show that the drivers, like I said here, the driver's stream of consciousness is really mixed up and messy, and it's not like a driver is thinking about driving all the time, or even at any one time as a distinct thing. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in drivers' heads, and driving is just one of those things. So to answer the question that I had, how often do drivers' minds wander? I think that on familiar drives on urban roads, I think 1/2 to 2/3 of the time. So if you're standing out on the street going for your walk for Prue's homework exercise and you see someone drive past, I reckon there's more than a 50% chance they're not thinking about driving. What are they thinking about? All these other things that you think about when you're driving or when you're in a car. And all drivers do this, right? This is not something that some people are immune to, or they wouldn't be human. It's something that is ubiquitous, and it's necessary as well, because as someone said in the chat, sometimes you're thinking about where you're going, and you have to do that to drive there successfully. You can't be thinking about the immediate road environment right in front of you all the time. You have to think about a lot of different things. You're thinking about your speed, your position on the road, looking at other traffic. Sometimes you might notice, like one of my drivers once said, oh, that car back there was just over the line. And I really like that example, because there are some things that other drivers do that kind of burst through your stream of consciousness, burst through your daydream, because it's like drivers have this unconscious safety bubble in their head, and when it's breached, they're like, oh, what was that? And it's kind of a precursor to preventing a collision. And experienced drivers are so attuned to it. Learner drivers, like Prue's teenager examples, are not so much. They're not so good at knowing what's critical to think about and what can be ignored. And it just happens unconsciously with practice, which is amazing, right? Humans and their brains are amazing.
Just a quick question, Bridget. Sorry.
Yeah.
We've just had a question about, wouldn't it depend on the type of road you're on, busy or urban road versus quiet street?
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're talking about in this slide. So the most mind wandering happens in quiet, predictable places. And all of my research was in urban streets, so streets in my home city where people live. But I'd extend that to rural roads, especially familiar rural roads would be the most mind wandering, because there's literally nothing to require drivers' attention. I see that there's a comment there about cyclists. We're going to talk about cyclists later on in this session as well, and whether their minds wander and same or differently. So in my research, the most mind wandering happened on quiet long stretches of street where there literally wasn't too much driving related to think about, which is not surprising, right? If it's not necessary, then drivers will switch off and think about dinner or something else. But the least mind wandering happens when people are forced to concentrate. And the first thought sample from that video, the driver said, I hate this roundabout and I'm glad I got through it. I think there was something like 23 out of 25 people who I took through this roundabout in Hamilton, they were thinking about driving. It's the most driving thinking place that I took anybody to, because it's horrible, it's narrow, you wouldn't design it like this these days, it's really constrained. And 5 out of the 25 said the phrase, I hate this roundabout. It's not just that it's dangerous, but the fact that it requires them to pay attention. It's like offensive that it's so tricky that they have to think about driving at that time. They're necessarily, and I know people who avoid it, and I don't think it's just because they don't think it's safe, which it isn't that unsafe compared to River Road where I was before, but it's that it's not as relaxing to drive through here, right? Because you can't switch off. And it's kind of like you go for a drive as if you go for a Sunday stroll. Sometimes you like to go the relaxing way, and sometimes you want to get there quicker, and if that takes you through these busy places, then you're up for that, and you know you're going to have to think about it. Isn't it interesting? It's so interesting. So
we've got another question here too about
sure.
Whether there's a difference between specialist drivers like truck drivers
Yeah.
motorbike. I imagine you weren't on the back of the motorbike asking this.
No, no, I think there is, and we'll come to that as well, because I think I'm going to ask everybody to put themselves in somewhere in my quadrant of what kind of driver you are. And I've got driving instructors as one of my examples, and I feel like professional drivers, like truck drivers, motorcyclists is different again, but I'll mention that when we talk about cyclists. So we should design environments that account for this, right? If half to 2/3 of the time in urban environments drivers aren't thinking about driving, then we need to make sure that pedestrians are safe when they interact with it. Someone just asked if that was 5 Crossroads, and yes, that's the one that everybody hates. I think I had a caption on there. So that means that we should slow people down who are driving whenever people might cross the road, and wake them up if we have to. And a good ways to wake them up are with vertical deflection, in other words, a speed bump like a raised crossing, or traffic lights, so signals. Most drivers respond to traffic signals most of the time, and I'll come back to when they don't later on. So the conclusion from all of my research, when you say, do wandering minds cause crashes, like that billboard said that inspired the research in the first place, I don't think you can say that. I think that's like saying old age causes broken hips. There are plenty of old people out there who don't have a broken hip. There's probably a correlation, but you can't do anything about it anyway, not the age thing. You can invest in keeping people safe despite wandering minds. And that's why we need a genuine safe system approach. And that was really the basis of the whole policy implications of my research, that the recommendations is not tell people to pay attention, it's design environments that comply with the safe system. And then it doesn't matter, because drivers are really good on the whole at regulating their attention. And here we are. So this is where the kind of truck driver, motorcyclist, driving instructor comes in. I think there are 4 kinds of drivers, and it relates to expertise and attentional regulation, which are on the same axes, because generally the more expert someone is, the better they are at regulating their attention. A driving instructor, I think a race car driver is different again, because they are like hyper vigilant. They are thinking about driving all the time, and that must be so tiring. I can't imagine how they do that round and around those racetracks or on rallies. Then we have people who don't report a lot of mind wandering, but their expertise is low. And that's what I call boy racers or rule breakers, because they are intentionally speeding. They have overinflated sense of their own skills. They're not actually that good. So even though they're thinking about driving, they're not doing a good job of it, because they're thinking about it and going too fast, or doing burnouts or donuts, or taking curves, the wrong angles. Then we have most people who are actually really good at regulating their attention, even though they daydream a lot. And that's what I call the competent cruiser. And then we have some people, and I had some drivers like this in my sample, who I call clumsy daydreamers. They daydream a lot, and they're not very good drivers. They're actually quite rare, but they're out there. And these people will likely have a lot of kind of low speed collisions, like they might bang into people in a car park when they're reversing, or they pull out at an intersection. There's not very good drivers, and there aren't that many of them. So what can we do about these things when we train people as drivers? And you know, my son is 14 years old, and I've already started talking to him about this kind of thing, about education, and actually sending him to school on his bike, because that helps people's awareness in traffic, right? He knows every now and then he comes home and says, oh, a driver looked straight through me today and I had to just swerve or something. All of these things contribute to a growing human's understanding of that threshold of risk, and when they need to be concentrating on things, and what to look out for, and what might be a precursor to a crash. Engineering and planning can help overcome the fact that people aren't thinking about what they're doing. So I don't mean that we engineer and plan people's attention. We engineer and plan environments that mean people are going to be okay, even if they are daydreaming. We can't change people's likelihood to report mind wandering. So sticking up a sign like pay attention is not helpful, unless it's a one-off situation, like there's a hazard ahead, there's been an accident, flashing lights alert you to this. That's a good idea, as long as it's rare and they're used you know, with care. Only in very rare situations where something very unusual is going on and you want people to pay attention, that's all right. So I think we've got a break soon, but just comment in the chat, from these 4 options, what kind of driver do you think you are? And I mean, you're all going to tell me you're either competent or diligent, of course. You might want to give an example if you know someone who's clumsy, or if you were a racer in your, rogue past, you might like to admit that in the chat. I think it's kind of liberating. So yeah, there we go. We're all competent cruisers, I bet. I think it's liberating to understand this, because we shouldn't feel guilty. Nobody should feel guilty about the fact that they daydream. That's just, in fact, it's a beautiful part of being human. Like, how amazing are our brains that we can walk and bike and drive places without thinking about it. That's very cool.
We have had some questions in there, Bridget. Some research indicates that training older people can have a negative impact on their safety as they overestimate their ability.
I mean, it's possible. I think older people are overrepresented in low cost crashes, like minor injury and property damage crashes, and the most fatal crashes come from the racers and rule breakers who are going over the speed limit on rural roads or in urban environments. So I think the best thing we can do for older drivers is to provide good alternatives to driving, so that it becomes easy to stop driving. Like in Timaru, where my mum lives, which is a small town of about 30,000 people in the South Island of New Zealand, they have an on-demand public bus, and my mum started getting it when she broke her arm a few years ago, and now she drives a little bit, she walks, and she gets that bus on demand with her phone when she feels like a ride somewhere. I just think that's the perfect way to transition people away from driving, because they've got options that they trust. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like this. I've been described as a girl guide driver. Very alert and stick to the rules.
Well, there you go. So hopefully this will help give you some empathy for other drivers in your life, maybe. My theory is, you can't change brains once especially someone's age 20, 25. Their patterns of thinking are the way that they are, and if that frustrates you, the best advice I can give you is not be in the car with them, because you're not going to change the way they are as a human by recommending they change some of the ways that they drive. So this is a newly formatted slide. What do you think, Prue? I really like this. This is like why raised crossings are so good for drivers whose minds wander. Firstly, they're conspicuous and they wake the drivers up to something going on. And secondly, even if they don't, then they slow the traffic down. So the risk of collision is lower and the risk of injury is low as well. And that's yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's that waking the drivers up. It's like an instruction manual. I was looking at some data yesterday, the Compass IoT data that shows the braking, and just looking at some raised crossings and showing, what a large proportion of people are braking on the approach, and that's perfect. We want people to be on the brakes, ready to.
Yeah, and often we're putting them in these urban environments. Like this is, near a beach. There's a lot of pedestrian activity. We want people to be going slower in any case. So the fact that everyone's slowing down, whether there's pedestrians or not, is a good thing. It's going to prevent not just pedestrian crashes, but all kinds of crashes, because the whole speed environment is lowered.
Jo, we've just got an interesting question here. My 20-year-old nephew is a real grandma when it comes to driving. Wonder if the new generation is a little more risk averse than the previous.
I mean, it's possible. Yeah. There's also evidence that younger generations are more climate aware and make other kind of high level decisions, about driving and what kinds of transport choices they might want compared to other people. I think, there's a lot of variation. Humans are so interesting. It can be a bit dangerous to generalize, but probably, having said that, I mean, every generation is different as well. And also cars are different, right? From a couple of generations ago, they're so much safer. That's just a fact. We didn't even have seatbelts when I was born. Like, how far have we come? And now we've got, collision avoidance and reversing cameras and seatbelt warning sounds and all this kind of stuff. So, cool. Yeah. So this billboard that was on the side of the road when I was starting my PhD, I would change it to a billboard for transport professionals that says, "Concentrate, failure to account for drivers' wandering minds causes crashes." It's not as catchy, or vote winning perhaps, but there we go. So it's 6 minutes past 3. We'll have a break, maybe 5 minutes, come back, 11 past whatever hour you're on at the moment, and we'll carry on then.
Thanks, Bridget.
Cool. Oh, welcome back, everyone. I'll assume we're all here.
My lunch is going to be really disappointing after looking at that.
Well, this is actually collated images from my trip to Europe last year, which was Tour de Café in Paris and London. And for those of you who've been to Paris, the coffee isn't reliably good like it is in Australia and New Zealand, so you have to be a good researcher. Fortunately, I've got experience. So I arranged my walking tour of Paris according to the top-rated cafes that served flat whites. They know what a flat white is, and they're going to be pretty good. And that one on the top left, for example, in the blue cup, you don't get a flat white like that in Paris unless you know where to look. And you still pay the same. It's like €6. You might as well get a proper one, right? It was so good. I was very smug and satisfied with myself. Yeah, cool. So anyway, enough of my wandering mind. Back to human behavior in traffic. So now some people have talked about cycling, alluded to cycling or motorcycling. What are people other than drivers thinking about? And as Prue was saying earlier, we should be able to go for a walk and allow our mind to wander. It's one of the most basic human things, is to go for a walk to clear your head. My grandmother, who was born in 1918 and died about 10 years ago, she had 7 children, and she told them whenever one of them had an upset stomach or was feeling not quite right, anything from mental health to physical health, her answer was go for a walk, go for a walk around the block. And we know that it's therapeutic, right? Because it clears your head. And as it happens, one of my friends who I met at a transport psychology conference studied mind wandering during walking, or at least attention during walking, and what people attend to. And her study, this is a picture from one of her studies where she put this sandwich board out in the street. All it says is welcome to the street. And she noticed that pedestrians would swerve to avoid this sandwich board. So this is in the Netherlands, where people typically walk on the right of the footpath. And she interviewed them 20 meters further down the street. Did you notice there was something there? They're like, no. Do you know, if you did, you know what it said? No. So these people had diverted out of their way to walk around this thing and then had no recollection of having done so. And that's classic human walking behavior. You just walk to avoid things, and we're used to doing that. So what about cycling? And Prue mentioned in my intro that I have a trailer that I put my cello on, and there it is in the flesh. I think that cycling is super interesting because it's not so much like walking, where it's got this long history of switching off and relaxing. Most of us who bike on urban streets in Australia and New Zealand know that it doesn't behoove us to switch our minds off and to mind wander when cycling. I think that there is a continuum, and we're going to talk a bit more about this in the chat, in Miro, I think. But this is my guesses about frequency of mind wandering during different kinds of travel, because I studied it during driving, but no one's really looked at the prevalence of mind wandering in other modes. So I think that the least mind wandering happens if you're a blind person walking. And I think that because I've talked to blind people about this exact topic, and they say that it's a bit like driving in really congested conditions when it's raining and dark in a city you're not familiar with. In that situation, you have to pay attention. You've got no choice. And a blind person says it's like that because if they switch off, they're going to trip or go the wrong way or walk out into the road or just not be aware. So there's this continuum. And I think cycling in busy traffic is a bit like that. Like you don't really switch off very much, and it can feel quite stressful. But if you're cycling on a quiet street or a quiet off-road path in the countryside or something, then your mind wanders, right? Then you daydream, and then it becomes more of a recreational activity rather than a stressful one. So I'm going to go back into Miro and think of a travel scenario like a something person doing something in something situation. So my example might be a grumpy person running in a suburban street. A grumpy person running in a suburban street. This is like someone who's gone for a run, they're not running away from something. I think they would be mind wandering a lot because they're grumpy, right? They're not thinking about the run or the street. They're thinking about themselves. So write a sentence in that format. A something person, something transport mode in this situation. See how good you are at following instructions, because some people in previous webinars have not been as good as others. A happy person strolling past the shops. Perfect. Strolling is a great word. Let's see how many adjectives we can come up with that mean travel, like flaneur. Do you know is it flaneur? Flaneur is a noun, isn't it, Prue? Like a flaneur is like a fashionable walking person, I think.
You've been to France. I haven't been to France.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Flaneur. It's like some people talk about tactical flaneurbanism.
Really?
Yeah. Really stylishly rearranging the streets.
This is what you learn in the transport psychology conferences,
Yes.
isn't it?
Another one that I like is, actually I made this up, tactical secaturbanism, which is when you go rogue and trim vegetation on your own street. Anyway, I digress. A taxi driver finding your address is good. In fact, I wonder if Google Maps has changed the ability of taxi drivers to switch on and off, right? Like they just kind of mindlessly follow the map, perhaps. A bank robber running from police. I haven't seen that one before, but you reckon not much mind wandering? Like, I think their mind might be wandering. They've got a lot to think about. It reminds me of Psycho, the film. And there's a scene where, what's her name? Marion Crane is on the run with this money and she's driving, and there's this scene, you think, oh my gosh, she's going to crash. It's got like the music and ominous and stuff. She's clearly not thinking about driving at that time. She's on the run with cash. What else have we got, Prue?
Right, okay. Let me see. An anxious person walking quickly to the train station.
Mm-hmm.
An angry person driving in busy traffic.
I love this. A 3-year-old running away from their parent. That's a really good example, because they really haven't learned even the difference between a road and not a road, right? Like there's no way they can be thinking about walking or running as a thing, because they don't conceptualize it like that. I assume I haven't done any surveys of 3-year-olds. That would be fun.
Well, it's interesting. I remember when I think he was about 3, and we went out to ride on a cycle track, and it was bitumen with a white line down the middle, and he had his little kind of wooden balance bike, and he said, no, I can't go on that, that's a road. And
oh wow,
it's quite interesting, because I noticed when we use shared zones and things, the kids don't know it's a shared zone. Like it's the same color, it's the same level, so it's all fine. Whereas that asphalt, that contrast, they do know. So, yeah.
Well, that's super interesting, that age 3, because when I was learning about psychology, they talk about age 3 and 4 is when children start developing schema. So like shortcuts for interpreting the world around them. And my son was 4 when I was doing that study, and we were in a garden centre, and there was a penny farthing shaped pot plant holder, right? So it was like about 1 metre high, maybe, shaped like a penny farthing, and it had a pot plant holder in the basket. And I said, oh, that's cool, it's a bicycle. He goes, it's not a bicycle. And then he goes, oh yeah, it is a bicycle. And you can almost see the brain connections forming, right? Like there's all these reasons that is not a bicycle. On the other hand, I can see what you're saying. So age 3 and 4 is super interesting. Cool. So you people are gold star. I love this, and we're going to keep a screenshot of this. It might be coming soon to a LinkedIn feed near you, because just such a great example of how this is a continuum. It's not like everybody's concentrating all the time, and you get it. So there you go, KPI, job done.
Sorry, a shopaholic driver seeing a sale pop up on
Totally. Oh, I talked a lot in my PhD about intrinsic motivations for what people see on the road. And when someone said earlier about a shop that they didn't know was there, the reason that we can switch off is because we've got this unconscious map of what our commute, for example, looks like. So when you're driving between home and work, if that's something you do a lot, your brain knows what to expect there. And when a building goes away or a new one is introduced into that scene, that's enough to capture your your mind, and a lot of my drivers would say, oh, there's a new blah blah there, I didn't notice that before, because they're updating their unconscious map, right? It's so interesting. I better move on. We can talk about that all day. So now this is where the new content comes in. Oh, brace yourself, Prue, it's very exciting. So these are the principles of inclusive access, and they're why raised crossings are such a great tool in the Transport Engineers Toolbox, and that they're called SOS. SOS stands for safe, obvious, smooth, step-free choices. And if you remember nothing else from this webinar today, I guarantee you'll remember this SOS. And when you're out and about traveling by any mode, you can look out and around you and see whether the walking environments are SOS or not. They account for people's wandering minds, and they make infrastructure inclusive. And the key to the inclusive part is that O in the middle, which I'll get to in a moment. These principles, I came up with them as part of some work for Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, on the pedestrian network guidance that we created. Interviewed a lot of disabled people, including not just mobility impairments, but people with autism, some adults with learning disabilities, cognitive impairments, deaf, blind, brain injury, lots of people, and then tested these principles again with groups of disabled people to say, do we think that these principles pretty much cover everything? Because if you took every impairment that someone had, let alone states and capabilities like we talked about earlier, there's a whole lot of little details that affect people, right? Like audible announcements, tactile warning indicators, having information in a variety of formats, making it legible. But really, they can all be boiled down to these 3 principles, which makes it really helpful for explaining it to your colleagues and other people that you're working with if you're reviewing designs or inputting into them yourself. So the first one is safe, and that is really what you probably know all about already. It's a safe system. Safe for pedestrians means that speeds are survivable if there's a collision. So everybody is either traveling slow so that those speeds are survivable, or they're separated so that a collision isn't possible. That's what safe means. And it includes feeling safe and feeling comfortable. So when we have a crossing like this, which is not a wombat, it hasn't got zebra markings on it, it's not a priority crossing, but I don't think it has a huge impact on how safe it is, because it means that traffic is definitely going to slow down. They've got no choice. And there are tactiles there, so pedestrians know that it's still a crossing. It's very strongly looks like a crossing. I don't think necessarily the fact that it doesn't have zebra markings affects how safe it is. However, it does affect how obvious it is. And the O in SOS is my favourite of the 3, because it's the one that we don't learn about at engineering school, or even when we're learning how to do transport, because it doesn't matter for crash statistics whether something was obvious or not. There was either a crash or there wasn't, but it matters a lot for inclusion, because obvious accounts for people who haven't been trained in the language of transport planning. And if you are ever in Paris, like I was fortunate to be, and you hire a bicycle, you know where you're allowed to be on the road, because they have painted bicycle symbols everywhere. Sometimes they're in the middle of the lane, sometimes they're on the side of the road, sometimes they're in an off-road path, but it's very obvious where you're supposed to be. And that's very reassuring when you're in somewhere foreign. In walking terms, obvious means something like zebra markings on crossings, because they are the most universally understood way to communicate that this is where you cross the street. Obvious transport also has different ways of communicating things to people. So digital communication, paper, timetables and things like that, on-street wayfinding, that is tactile and audible. So audible announcements at bus stops, braille at public transport stops. The more ways that we can have to communicate information to people in simple ways, the more obvious it will be. So this example is from the Base shopping centre in Hamilton, where I live. These probably aren't even legal zebra crossings because they're not on a formal road. But the fact that they're not raised doesn't, to me, affect how obvious they are, except that a raised one is a bit more conspicuous, which can make them obvious. But the zebra markings are universally understood, right? People stop for pedestrians in this car park because they know that that's what those markings mean. They are very obvious. And one of the problems then we have is that a crossing that is obvious but not safe is going to result in pedestrian injuries. And here's an example of one in Gain and Hamilton, where I live, and there was a fatal collision at this mid-block signalised crossing within a few months of it opening, and the driver apparently did not notice that the lights were there, which happens sometimes with signals, right? Like especially if there's no secondary arm out over the road, it's not in the driver's line of sight. And so because this is in an urban street with a 50km/h speed limit, the environment is conducive to speeds above 50, right? People just comfortably cruise along there between 50 and 60. In fact, this is the same street where that driver was in my video, where she said, looking at the guy behind me, not comfortable with a lady cruising along at 50. This is a street where you would get people going 60 pretty regularly. So to put signals in there is all well and good as long as people stop. Sometimes they don't because they're human, which is why raised crossings are safer than mid-block signals by themselves, depending on the context, of course. Oh, look, it's a brand new slide. So this is not in your notes because I literally just put it in this morning, because in Hafez's webinar on Wednesday talked about asphalt art, and he said there's been research done and it's good, it's safe. And I think that is true, that asphalt art is almost always safe. But the problem with it is that it's not always obvious to people that it's a road crossing or not. And I like this picture because the adult there is holding the hands of the children and leading them across the street. If those children were left to their own devices, I guarantee they wouldn't be able to tell you where the road ended and the the footpath started, or the public plaza area on that street. So it goes back to what I was saying in the first place about the difference between road safety and inclusion. From a road safety perspective, asphalt art is probably fine. From an inclusion perspective, not so much, because there are people in our community who won't be able to tell you whether that is legally road or not, and therefore it's going to either put them in an unsafe situation or put them off using it at all or going there in the first place, which is counterproductive, right? So I'm a big fan of art, a big fan of street art and murals, but not on the asphalt, not on the actual live lane of our streets. And that's what our new guidance in New Zealand is saying about roadway art.
So we had a question there. Is this a formal crossing point there? Or?
Yeah, it is. That's in Wellington, in Cuba Street. It's actually a signalised crossing. So you can see the signal pole in that picture.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a formal crossing point.
Yeah.
I think there's another one somewhere in New Zealand I don't think we're allowed to use them at zebra crossings anymore. We've got quite strong rules now about it.
Yeah.
Very contentious, and we better not spend too much time on them, but that's my gut feeling, is that they're probably safe. They're definitely not as inclusive as they could be. So the second S in SOS stands for smooth, step-free choices, and that's probably the one that we do the best as transport people. We know that we should put in ramps when there's stairs. We know that not everybody can navigate every street, but breaking news, I've even said it's embargoed. That's how special this is. Nobody's even seen this. Not even my client who paid for this work has seen it. So this is I'm just so excited about this graph that I had to show you. Nobody in the world, as far as I can tell, has ever done the work to say how steep is too steep for a person using a wheelchair to go up a street. No one's ever asked them or done that work. So what we've done is ask people who use wheelchairs, is this street usable for you? Can you use it or not, or somewhere in between? And we collected a whole lot of data about that. And then we actually went out and tested those streets. So we gave them a sample of streets and asked them about them, went out and measured the gradient on those streets. And then we came up with this graph to say, well, actually, if your gradient is beyond sort of 6, 7, 8%, most people who use wheelchairs are going to have a lot of difficulty using that path. And that means, well, it means a lot of things. It means that maybe we shouldn't bother investing as much in infrastructure on those places because they're not the most inclusive ones. Maybe we should be investing in accessible routes where more people are likely to be able to use. Maybe we should just be publicising this information in maps so that if people are visiting and they have a pram or a buggy, or they have someone using a wheelchair with them, that they can understand what the accessible routes are in their cities. I think this is, going to become a lot more useful in terms of understanding inclusion, so that we can make it more transparent where people can and cannot go.
Ooh, it's opening up the questions.
Is there a specific one now? Should I carry on?
Oh, they're just coming through. I think carry on for a minute and then I'll come back.
Okay. So I've said here that not all infrastructure needs to be step-free. We can have steps, we can have hills. We're not going to flatten the earth like we're playing some big game of SimCity just for the sake of everyone being able to use every street. The important thing really in all of our work is that we want people to be able to access opportunities. So as long as there are options for people to get between an origin and a destination, other infrastructure can be provided. So for example, if I was going to do an equity assessment of a project that involved a tram line running along a hilly street, I'd say, well, that's all well and good. Here's the walkable catchment. Only people within sort of, 20 or 50 meters of this stop might be able to get there because it's on a hill. But there should be alternatives. There should be safe cycleways. There should be drop-off zones for taxis and rideshare and things like that. So it's about the whole transport system and not just every single bit of infrastructure being over-designed when that might not be the most useful way to go about it.
I might just go back to a couple of, have we got time, do you think?
Yeah, sure.
So what do these gradients look like? I presume that's going to be a bit hard at this point.
Well, for example, a 6% grade is the steepest that any state highway would be designed to be in New Zealand. Pretty much. You wouldn't go over that unless you had a very good reason to. So it's like a hill that you would puff when you're biking up is about 6%. Yeah. You'd notice it. So they're not super steep. 8% is the grade that you're allowed to have for the entry to a building, but it can only be over 1 meter. So that's pretty steep. Yeah.
So and one thing that I've found quite useful with this is to just go out with a measuring device and get a sense of it. You kind of got to calibrate your own judgment for crossfall, for linear steepness.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we did that more often. I think it's kind of a basic civil engineering thing that we don't do enough of, just to understand gradients, because if we did that, then we could advertise them, right? Like I'd be a fan of that in urban places. You can go this way, but it's going to have a maximum of 10% grade. Even me, if I was tired, would be like, oh, no, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, let's got one more.
Questions about, is there a length associated with these grades?
There's interaction with length for sure, but that's the beauty of this work, I think, is that it's talking about kind of a city block length. So what's that, maybe 50, 80 meters over that kind of length, whereas previously we only designed ramps in terms of the building code, which is over short distances, and you can go, up to sort of 5%, but then you've got to have a level platform every 10 meters. This is over longer distances, but recommend more research. Talk to me, people. Okay, let's go into Miro. This is the last one for today. What makes these crossings obvious or not, and for whom? So I don't have any specific words that you need to comment on with this one, just reflecting. Are these obvious or not? Are they obvious to you? Are they obvious to a child? Are they obvious to you visiting great aunt? What do you reckon? These are some crossings near my house. And even though I think about this stuff quite a lot, I quite often go for a walk, and then I would say to myself, because I think too much, I didn't even notice whether there were curb cuts at that crossing. I just walked, If we don't rely on these things, it's very easy to miss them, which is why it's so important to include principles of inclusion, because we're just inbuilt to think about things that affect us personally. We don't have good habits.
It seems to me that it requires constant work, like checking your unconscious biases. Like it's almost like, it needs to be done in formal training regularly. You need to be checking yourself on a weekly, monthly basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we need better processes to account for it in our work. And before then, it's up to us to, talk to people who are affected, which is what I'm going to touch on shortly. Yeah, this is all really good. I really actually quite like that the first one, someone said this is obvious to an average pedestrian. That's true, right? Like I was thinking this morning about how we tend to design walking environments for the average. And if we were doing that for building design, like I was trained as a civil engineer, and when you design a building, you have to load it up with the wind for that area, right? So you look up a graph that tells you what the common prevailing winds are in this area and design the building to survive that. But then you look up another graph that says, well, what's the worst earthquake that's likely to hit this building? And a building is designed for that worst case scenario, whereas we've inherited these streets that were really designed for the average pedestrian. And the worst case scenario, which is a blind person or a 3-year-old or someone using a wheelchair, it's just, we don't even know whether the street works for them or not, because we've never gone to the extent of measuring that or going back and checking. And that's the revolution that's coming now, because you're all so enlightened. You're going to go and do it everywhere. We'll carry on. So stay there if you want to, but I'm going to keep moving through the slides because we've got a bit more to go. So here's an example of a street that I think is safe, obvious, and step-free. It's a signalized crossing in a level pseudo shared street environment, but I think it looks quite obvious because the pavement's a different color. It clearly looks like traffic lanes. There's traffic lights there for people who want to cross at the lights, but if you just want to walk across because it's all pretty slow, then you can do that as well. And I think that actually works really well. In fact, it's kind of like a raised crossing because this whole platform is raised and the traffic's going slowly and it's a priority crossing. So let's bring that all together. A kind of summary. How raised crossings work for all people. They're conspicuous, they're safer because they're a speed management intervention, whether people are thinking about it or not. They're super obvious to pedestrians and cyclists. Whether cyclists will stop and give way to pedestrians is another story, but it's not common that there are collisions between the two. So when we think about who we design raised crossings for in conjunction with why we do it in the first place, which is what Hafez was talking about, we want to design crossings that are safe for all people. That includes all road users, all different kinds of modes, and people who could be operating at less than perfect capacity when they encounter the crossing. Where we put a crossing, which is what Prue's going to talk about next week, depends on who is driving, cycling, walking there now and who might cross in the future. So sometimes I think about this stuff in terms of we're designing for ourselves, like none of us are getting any younger, right? Like in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, imagine if you are still around in 50 years from now, what kinds of characteristics and states might you have? Who might you be with? You might be with grandchildren or great-grandchildren. What are you going to need from that environment? It can be really helpful to think about it like that. And in terms of how we design them, as I said, the design of any transport infrastructure really comes back to the way that humans are, what their capacity is, what their reaction times are, and all of this is kind of basic psychology that we have design standards for to account for that humanness, and crossings that are SOS work for everyone. So now I'm just going to spend 5 minutes talking about disability sector engagement, because it's a really useful thing to do. As Prue was saying, it's something that we have to keep reminding ourselves about, designing inclusive environments. If we can talk with people for whom it is their lived experience day in, day out, and who work with a range of disabled people, then our designs will only be better and our decisions will be better as well. And we'll also get more informed. So the reason that I advocate for engagement with disabled people, even just meeting them and going for coffee, if you can justify that in your job and in your work, to go and form relationships and understand who the advocates are in your local area, then it's going to make you a better professional. We don't necessarily have mandated input from community in our day-to-day work. We have submissions processes on plans and decisions, but not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, even though the community is obviously affected quite a lot. And just to recap what I said earlier, that we don't have an outcome measure for inclusion, which is why I said then that I think in the absence of that, until the revolution comes and we do measure the accessibility of every street, we know where people can and cannot go, and we know about equity of participation. Until we get to that point, we need to talk to people and find out, and that's why engagement's so important. So yeah, road safety has all these things. It has vision, policy, priorities, design standards. We do monitoring, we do before and after studies, and we do research on it. And all of it is meant to answer this question: are we reducing crashes? Accessible transport and inclusion, like I say, there's some words in policy about designing for all people. We have some design standards for some aspects of it, like ramp grades and things. We do some research, but we don't have a vision. We don't set priorities to meet that vision. We don't do any monitoring of who can get places and who can't, because we don't have this underlying question that anybody's paid to answer. It's important because the communities that we're designing for are a lot more diverse than we are. And we did the survey of Engineering New Zealand Transportation Group members in 2019. Less than 2% were Indigenous or Māori, compared to 17% of the population as a whole. Less than 2% of us identify as disabled, compared to a quarter of the population as a whole. And those disability rates are pretty common in Australia, comparable in Australia as well. So we don't have the same lived experience as the communities we're designing for, which is a problem. So to sum all of that up, disability sector engagement can help improve, because our design standards, they get traded off, right? And that's why I was saying earlier that some of these stories and examples, hopefully you'll take them back with you and help to use them to become advocates for raised crossings and other infrastructure that is more inclusive than the environments that we've inherited. So to that end, there's a disability sector engagement guide. This link is here. You can download it. I think it's now on Waka Kotahi's website as well, under the pedestrian network guidance, and it just goes through how to proactively include people. The reason I think we need to do this is because this is a little chart I made up that says at the moment we have a lot of complaints. We talked earlier in this session about relying on complaints. What we want to get to is proactive inclusion, a bit like road safety, where we go out and measure crashes and we know where the worst places in the network are in terms of crash outcomes. We don't rely on people having to complain that they crashed on the road and they think it might be dangerous, even though that informs part of the response. So the first question to ask is, do we understand the impacts of this activity on disabled people? If we don't know whether it affects them or not, then we can do some background research on that. Here's an example of, say we're going to do a school gate road safety project. Do we think that this project might affect disabled people? Do we have any clue? Yes, we do. We think it probably will. That's just a common sense kind of understanding. If they are not impacted, then we don't have to do anything in particular. I'm not asking us to engage on every single thing. So there might be some processes like pavement material specifications. They don't affect disabled people any differently from other people. So we can just carry on without engagement for that. If disabled people are impacted by this activity, then we need to know whether it affects specific local communities or people as a whole. What I mean by that is, if we're consulting on a plan or a national policy, then we will talk to agencies, advocacy groups at a national level that are used to responding to those kinds of things on behalf of disabled people themselves. So if it's a generic policy or a national plan, policy statement, proposal to change road user rules or something, then we should be talking with People with Disability Australia, for example, or New Zealand's disabled persons organisations. And in this guide, you can find lists of those. But in our example, this does affect local communities, right? It's on a local street. It's actually digging something up. So we can go and find the local disability community, and you can find them through those other channels. So New Zealand's Disabled Persons Assembly, for example, will be able to put you in touch with local contacts to get the word out, to find local people who are affected to have a say on it. And the school itself, or the community that you're in, will be able to help front some of that engagement. If you're at a school, there are likely to be people at the school who use its mobility parking, for example, who have an opinion on these things, and you can find them for input. The reason that we're doing this in our school gate project is, for example, we might be putting in a new crossing. If we engage with disabled people, they might say, well, actually, I can't get to that crossing because there's a curb needs fixing 100 metres down the road. So as part of the work, you might be able to also fix that curb or fix a bus stop or improve lighting or something that you wouldn't have known about if you hadn't done that engagement. And it really helps to have those good local stories because, for better or worse, a lot of our decisions are made by political imperatives. And if we can have good local stories, like this is a real one that I had from a new crossing that was put in at that 5 Crossroads, actually, example from the video, where someone told me their mother-in-law couldn't walk to the shop because there were too many roads to cross. Now there's actually a raised zebra crossing put in, she can make that trip on her own. So this is like a real impact that doesn't yet come through in our benefit cost analyses, but it's actually changing people's lives for the better and improving that equity of participation so people can actually cross the street. And that's super helpful when the only other argument might be a traffic model that shows delay to cars from putting in a raised crossing. We need to have the counter side to say, actually, this is helping someone to live their life, and all it's doing to the traffic is making it go the speed limit. Where's the problem here? Yeah. Cool. So that's it from today. I'm going to go through a summary. If you've got any other questions or burning comments or stuff, put them in the chat now and I'll run through this. Oh, you might like to do this as well if you're thinking about it. What have you learned today, or what stands out to you as an answer to this question? Why are raised crossings a good design solution for all people? Just put that in the chat if something comes to mind, and I'll go through this summary. So inclusion is important because it's the law. We've got human rights legislation. Sometimes we would like to do more about that, and hopefully today you've got some more tools in your toolkit to do your job better and include people that you might not have thought about including before. What have raised crossings got to do with driver behaviour? Well, drivers' minds are wandering most of the time. My friend who is blind tells me that this fact terrifies him and makes him even more likely to be paying attention every time he's out and about. They're conspicuous and they slow the drivers down. So if their mind is wandering, it doesn't even matter as much. Why are human states and traits important? It's important so that we don't just put people in a box and say, well, we're designing for wheelchair users, as if that's a different outcome from just thinking about humans and their everyday, varying strengths and capabilities. We're designing for all people and all the ways that they feel when life comes at them, Some different permanent, temporary and situational impairments. Remember to think about that next time you're carrying a coffee or two down the street and you can't use your hands as easily, or even if you're wearing high heel shoes, non-sensible shoes, it just makes a difference to how you move around. And all of these situational things can be really useful ways for you and your colleagues to relate to the challenges that some people have that are more permanent. The age distribution I only touched on, but hopefully you can look back at your slides and have a think about that and how you might be able to find that age distribution for your area. You can find public statistics to do that, to plot that distribution, and just to help you think about who is in your community that you're designing for and what their needs might be. Just as further evidence, really, because I've found that if you can say, well, actually, there's 733 people in this community who are aged over 70 years, that can be helpful politically to get some of these decisions through. What are the SOS principles of inclusive street design? Safe, obvious, smooth, step-free choices. I think hopefully you'll all remember all of those, and you can share them, particularly if you're doing a design review or talking to your colleagues about the pros and cons of something. You can say, well, is it safe, obvious and step-free? And if you're ticking those boxes, if you're feeling uncomfortable about it, then it's likely one of those boxes hasn't been ticked. So it's quite a useful metric. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention and engagement. It's been absolute delight to be working with you. If you do have any other questions or your mind's wandering when you're driving and you think of something to ask me, do feel free to email or connect with me on LinkedIn, because I'm very chatty and distractible. So yeah, and have fun in the next couple of webinars.
Just a couple of questions here, Bridget. So
Sure.
I've already suggested to, I think it was James, that he get in contact, Jason, he was interested in transport psychology. And I think this is something that a number of us have not aware that it's actually a field. And how do you learn more about this field? What's your suggestions?
Oh yeah, I might give something to Kathy to put in my module thing in the thing about that. There's lots of ways. I have lots of thought, and all over New Zealand and Australia there's stuff you can do. So yeah, I'll let you know.
Great, I'm keen too.
Excellent.
I just want to draw out a couple of things here in terms of what people said they were learning. Adam Dare said an accessible crossing for disabled people is also safer and simpler to use for everyone. So I think that's a key message from your webinar today.
Yeah.
Improve safety for all road users, particularly for vulnerable road users, wider societal benefits than just safety. I like this one. There's another one down here. I have a daughter with ADHD/autism, Asperger's, so it really brings her issues with accessibility to the forefront for me and how we need to cater for her and others.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, good reasons that people see race crossings as a good outcome. I got some complete gems today. I think if I'm feeling self-centered and I'm not doing a very good job of thinking about how others experience the world, I'm just going to think about 90-year-old me in my my purple jumpsuit. I've decided that's going to be my outfit, and that's what I'm going to be. That's what I'll design for.
You'll be nice and conspicuous.
Nice and yes. Look out for me. So. Great. Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone, and Prue will see you next week. And like I say, do stay in touch. It's one of the great benefits of this course that we all break the ice and get to know each other. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you all again in the future. Yeah, and do follow Bridget on LinkedIn if you don't already. It is, I would say, a very good read as well. Yeah, and next week we will be really, taking off from where Bridget was today and going in where can we put crossings in, how will they service that that need in the network, and yeah, taking it from who to the next stage of slightly finer detail. Wonderful. Thanks, Prue. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Bye.